Reintroductions, that is the topic that keeps on giving. And we discussed this topic many times on this podcast before. I even recorded an solo episode about reintroductions, which is not happening often, but I felt like I'm going to give my views on reintroductions. So that episode was episode 169. And then we talked about reintroductions almost while we recorded every podcast about rewilding. There's almost no way to talk about rewilding without talking about reintroductions. And today, our guest is once again the one and only Alex Lees. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you again. Alex previously was on the episode 93 when we talked about Amazon jungle and everything that's going on there. And then you just dispelled a few of the misconceptions. And speaking about misconceptions, in episode 191, I talked with Ian Parsons, who compiled a book called Rewilding's Myths and Misconceptions. And you, together with Ian Carter, who was also a guest on the podcast at least twice, wrote a chapter about reintroductions. And this is what we're going to talk about today. Alex, but before we jump into all those things, you are well known in social media. You used to be very active on Twitter. You've gone from Twitter right now, right? You moved to Blue Sky all full time.
Yeah, I didn't deleted my Twitter account in the hope that maybe one day I can feel safe in using it again. So I've not entirely closed the door, but I've not been posting since Musk started disassembling science in the US. So out of protest, certainly.
I'm just off most of social media other than posting stuff from my podcast, but I said it many times. I'm just winding down from social media because I just don't like what it does to our brains and the whole thing. But for all those people, because I presume there's going to be a substantial group of people who were tracking you and what you were posting on Twitter, and now you're gone. What you're up to right now?
Well, I guess in terms of a social media outlet, I've been using Blue Sky, perhaps not as much as I had historically Twitter, and maybe perhaps because Blue Sky is not quite as diverse. I mean, it's a great place to sort of find out about latest academic research, but it's not got that same sort of community of different people. It'd be great if it could assemble that, but I still find it a really sort of useful platform. It'd just be great if it was perhaps a bit of a broader church to talk about these issues, which are sort of, I guess, in many ways, sort of block progress on the sort of entwined climate and biodiversity crises. So, having more stakeholders in the room, I think, for these conversations is always super, super important.
And I'm tracking you on Blue Sky, and folks, Alex's output is as it used to be. A lot of interesting stuff there. So go and give him a follow on Blue Sky if Blue Sky or social media, for that matter, is still your thing. Alex, you're most well known from working with birds and posting about birds, and that's your main area of research. Why you decided to tackle subject of introductions or reintroductions in the book about rewilding?
So, I mean, I guess partly because that does overlap with the bird work, partly because it's something which, I mean, both ecologists talk a lot about, but also people who perhaps aren't qualified ecologists talk about a lot. And it's got a big sort of media buzz, and we talk about rewilding and reintroductions as going hand in hand with that. Because I guess I'm a stakeholder in these systems. There are lots of species I would like to see back here by one way or another. And because I think that all these things should be science-led. And I've seen, some evidence for sort of some of these processes perhaps not being so science-led. And, I'm very interested in evidence-based conservation full stop. So I think there's a lot of sort of synergies between where we are with rewilding and other things that I do and have a stronger, perhaps, academic interest in. But, I have I'm actually for the PhD student at the moment working on a PhD project looking at land use change and rewilding in the Peak District, for instance. So I do actually have, I guess my, as a mouthpiece, I was talking about rewilding before I had an academic interest, and now I guess I normally do through various different channels. But certainly as a stakeholder, I'm also very interested in sort of, bending the curve of biodiversity loss, as it were.
let's jump right in. And you argued in your chapter, and your and Ian's, that reintroductions of species may actually cause dewilding rather than rewilding. And this is like in a direct, opposition or contradiction to statements that I heard from people, again, PhD ecology people who said things like, oh, every rewilding project should be mandatory, they have a reintroduction aspect of it. And I was like, oh, that can't be right. So you say, well, it can really lead to dewilding rather than rewilding. Could you please elaborate on that?
So various different reasons for that sort of stance there. I guess it's argued in this sort of the IUCN text on reintroduction, sort of the best reintroduction is one that doesn't have to happen, right? And I think to a certain extent, we forget that species, many of them, can return on their own, which is, and some people maybe don't seem to recognise this. Obviously, and as an island nation, both the UK and the island of Ireland aren't going to get terrestrial mammals back, because most of them are, none of them are going to swim there. But for many bird species, for instance, recolonisation is possible. It's possible that might take a little bit longer, but it's obviously cheaper in the long run. And that's also the case for lots of other things, lots of invertebrates, even many plants. Species do spread naturally. And I think when we assume that agency, that we're going to sort of replace those natural processes, as you were, I think that is a little bit rewilding, because really we talk about rewilding being about natural processes and letting us sort of take our hands off for a minute and let nature sort of do what it wants to do. And I don't think we sort of give biodiversity in many cases the credit that it should have for the ability to expand to new places, quite quickly. And that's obviously the case for species with relatively high dispersal capacity, and not the case for instance, beavers, which would not have reached recolonize the UK. So I'm certainly not against rewilding, reintroduction rather, projects where there's a strong case that species was present in a region within what we call the Holocene, so within a recent geological epoch, if you like, and their loss from Britain or Ireland in this case, or indeed anywhere else, is a result of human-led processes. So we're talking about extirpations, if you like, because of overhunting or habitat loss or whatever it has, rather than, for instance, species which disappeared in prehistory because their climate niche disappeared, for instance. So my take on this is that we shouldn't be moving species into regions where there might have been some presence in a previous interglacial period. But in this case, there isn't in the most recent one. So we're not, in a sense, reintroducing a species. We are, ourselves, sort of becoming this big evolutionary force. We're not fixing a historical problem. We are ourselves, being the force which is moving species around the people on the planet. We're not fixing historical loss. We're simply doing in many ways what people have done for a long time. In the case of sort of almost like in the book, we mentioned sort of Victorian acclimatization societies. People think, well, it'd be great if we had species X, Y, and Z or whatever. And a point we just try and make really hard is that the fossil record is not a menu of all possible reintroductions, because every time we've had, an ice age, we've had a different suite of species, basically. So it's like a different throw of the dice. And I think we should try and bring ourselves back to where we should be, rather than just seeing all these previous interglacials as being a definitive roadmap to what could be here. For a start, because even the climate niches at those times were very, very different. I've seen some sort of crazy species advance as possible reintroduction candidates like pikers and such like, which that those species don't occur anywhere near Western Europe at the moment, although they were historically present in the UK when we had a steppe type ecosystem. So, we're looking to fix what was lost basically in the last 10,000 years, rather than just trying to, sort of create a mishmash of species, most of which would probably be unsuccessful anyway, because their climate niches are not represented here.
Hmm. Yeah, and there's a couple of things here to what you said. So first of all, is it a little bit of a really distinction between patience versus urgency in terms of, because in a context of UK, we were talking, or in a book I think you were talking about the red kites, which is like, oh, we reintroduced, that's a success, but maybe we wait and see what happens. On many episodes, we talk obviously about the wolves in Yellowstone, which was the same story, like or even in Colorado, which was even like a democratic vote on the wolves, and that created a massive social conflict, because then that reintroduction is becoming political rather than ecological, because you want, and the whole thing. But then we are in a sort of urgent situation to do something. We don't have. I think, and you can disagree with that and make a counter argument, but often we don't have 50, 100 years to wait until something comes back, because it's not here for a reason. And maybe that reason. So, like in these arguments, like, if something recolonizes, it is less likely to get into trouble and get into a human wildlife conflict. And then you drop something in, and also you have these local things, right? Like a local genetics. Well, I think I was on some podcast and I make this comparison that you take a guy from UK and you drop him in Thailand without nothing, right? It's like, he's also humans, right? But there's like, hey, where am I? What are we doing? Like, food is wrong and the water will probably cause him problems, and so on and so forth. So how do you approach this reconciliation of like, well, we should be patient versus like, well, we need to urgently do something? And I think that beavers may be a good example. I think you're kind of like a positive towards beaver,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely. So there's a lot to unpack there. I think that the human wildlife conflicts is one angle, and that you sort of need to divorce that from the other arguments we're talking about, because quite often there were some species which you could probably put back and they would just work, and there would be we cause no offense to anyone. Whereas some of the species we probably actually do need back, some of those big, fierce creatures will cause problems, and that requires a different set of approaches, not all of which have been followed, but maybe we can return back to that later on. I just want to come back to your first point, which is the urgency. And I think this is really, really important point, because sometimes when I've sort of challenged some people's sort of roadmaps for reintroductions, or their menu they want to choose from, if you like, and they've said, well, we've got to get these things back because we have a nature crisis, etc., etc., etc. Now, most of the biodiversity that we reference in our nature crisis, the big losses, they've happened quite recently. They've happened in the 20th century. They've happened because of probably in the UK more about habitat degradation, and because most of the loss in the UK happened a long time ago in terms of loss of our old growth forests, loss of most of the wetland areas. There's been ongoing losses and they've continued, but a lot of our semi-natural habitats or farmland habitats have been degraded. And by that, I mean, you've got a switch from hay meadows to silage, so one type of grassland to another. You've got this loss and degradation of habitats. We've also got the problem of biocides in the environment, diffuse nitrogen pollution. You've got the spectre of climate change. All of these things that are happening recently, right? The losses haven't been caused by the loss of, a lot of these species we're talking about are reintroducing, which happened millennia ago, right? Our baseline we're measuring when we talk about losses is something which has happened relatively recently. And in many cases, when people say, well, if we put these species back, we'll get the other things back as well, there's an inherent problem there as well, for instance. So, for instance, in continental Europe, we have seen beavers have recolonized and or been reintroduced in many areas. They deliver all sorts of ecosystem benefits. It's great to have them back. But, equally, people have also tried to link their loss in the UK to declines in species like willow tits. And there's zero evidence for that. Willow tit was a common bird in the 1960s. Beaver's been gone for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Equally, on the continent, willow tit's now declining and beaver's increasing. So, linking these things I don't think is particularly helpful. when we talk about the biodiversity crisis, we need to think about what are those drivers of the crisis. It doesn't tend to be the loss of these, loss of any single species, or indeed often any guild of species. However, that does have some caveats. For instance, we can probably link understory overbrowsing and overgrazing of, too many deer, for instance, to woodland degradation, to impacts on species, at which point, having some large predators around would be great, because that would, you can talk about landscape of fear or just reducing prey abundance, and that would probably have some, good, some real biodiversity benefits. Equally, we can, manage those species via other means, that we don't seem to be very good at it, for all sorts of the reasons which you probably covered in many different podcasts. But I think we need to be very careful about thinking that species X or Y will suddenly fix these problems, because they're mostly not caused by the loss of any single species, precisely because there's a huge amount of redundancy in the system. There's lots of species that perform similar functional roles. We should put them back if they were here because we drove their loss. And that, for me, should always be the single most important justification for reintroduction, is we're putting back historical wrong. Because if we start justifying it just based on the ecological benefits that these species may or may not give, and often those are overhyped, then you sort of start standing there trying to convince policymakers that we need these species, and actually it turns out we didn't really need them at all, and they haven't fixed any of our problems. But really, we should just justify having them back because we got rid of them, and they're probably likely to have some co-benefits, but I quite often don't think to the level of which we've been told, because quite often the way when we compare where we know they do deliver benefits is in a completely different ecosystem, right? If you went and measured how wolves interact with other species in boreal forest or somewhere where you've got an entirely different ecosystem, that's not the same as what wolves may or may not do around Milton Keynes. So I think we should be really careful about trying to transport impact from one system, natural systems, to an entirely anthropogenic system where we may not get much of a result at all. In fact, it's questionable whether they'll even persist within those landscapes. So I think those are really, really important points. On social impacts, well, they're super, super important. If you don't bring stakeholders along with you, then it's always going to be deemed to fail. And there's lots and lots of people who talked about that. It's not something I'm an expert on at all, but I do recognize that I see many schemes where they fail to engage with stakeholders to the extent that they should do, and that's probably set back rewilding efforts. And we have to acknowledge where there are problems. We have to come up with solutions to those problems and just be pragmatic about it. And hopefully then we can get, some of these large mammals back. But when it comes to that pace of change and how long to wait, well, if it might take 30 or 40 years to something you might be able to do in 5, but what's actually the chances of success if you bring some large bird, establish, a captive bred population on some wetland in Western England, which is completely disjunct, by thousands of miles from the nearest population? You've got a conservation dependent population, which is going to take lots and lots of work. Whereas, just waiting a bit of time, building habitat, creating stepping stones, these things will reappear. I mean, the example we talk about is pelicans, which is definitely a British bird. It would definitely be on my potential list of reintroductions. But I think rather than spending huge amounts of money taking birds from the Danube Delta and putting them in the Somerset levels, I would advocate for, let's try and connect the dots with wetland mega reserves across Western Europe. We already have had a Dalmatian pelican in the UK. I'm sort of currently chair of the British Ornithologists Records Committee that assesses these records. We accepted one from about a decade ago as being a wild bird. They do disperse. They move a very long way. As that population increases, they will arrive. A classic example of this, which is happening right now, is an incredible displacement of glossy ibis. Now, when I first started birding, the first time I actually went abroad, sort of going birding, was in the mid-90s and going to south of France, the Camargue. And just at that time, the first glossy ibises were being seen in the Camargue, and the species first bred in Spain, I think, around also the same time in the mid-90s. And now there's tens of thousands of pairs of these things. And, there's several hundred flying around Britain. There's single flocks, almost 100 in Cornwall at the moment, and hundreds in Ireland as well. And it's quite the species already has bred in Britain. It bred a couple of years ago. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're now going to be lots of pairs breeding in Britain next year. But you can imagine 20 years ago, you could say, well, especially if someone found a fossil bone somewhere, you could say, oh, we should definitely get the ibis. It'll take ages. And so nature shocks us sometimes how fast things can adapt. What we need to do is open the gateway and make sure their habitats are there, the conditions are there for these things to arrive. And then species do move. They're going to have to move because of the climate change, which we're sort of forcing on species. But also historically, they've had to move as well. With the Earth's been through various phases in its history, sometimes quite recently, when the climate has moved, and changed in a sort of shockingly fast way. Thinking in terms of immediately post-glacial, we saw huge changes to the whole Palearctic ecosystems. The Sahara went from sort of wetland to desert incredibly quickly, and birds and other species had to adapt to this. So what we need to do is make sure the conditions are there for them to adapt and for these species to be able to move on their own. If not, I think we need a justification that they were here prior. That's my sort of personal standpoint on these things. I think if we just end up playing the game of, well, we can move species that wouldn't have colonized otherwise, then, but we just end up picking and choosing species, and we lose the insularity of our islands. Britain and Ireland have their own unique species, which is not found anywhere else in the world, and they exist because we are islands, right? We're not as spectacular sort of endemic communities that they have on in the Galapagos, Hawaii, or even the Azores, but we have unique species, and those species arise because of changes in how species interact, and having a slightly impoverished, if you like, flora and fauna is expected of islands. And then you have different communities interact in different ways, and as a result, you get new species, or some species become more abundant in those areas. And things like great crested newts may be a good example of that, right? The best populations in Europe because we have an impoverished population of amphibians, simply because very few species reached our shores before that land bridge was cut off. And I don't think us moving all these species and continentalizing floras and faunas is particularly useful. I do, to an extent. There's a counter argument that says, well, you go outside and like all plants you see are non-native, but I don't think two wrongs sort of make a right. I don't think we need to then saying that just because it's a problem that we can create even more of a problem, because you just don't know where the problem will be. And I think a good example perhaps is Rhododendron pontica, right, which is native to Iberia, apparently doing quite badly there and quite rare. You could make an argument that we should introduce that species into the UK and Ireland, but we've got a counterfactual for that because we have that species in the UK and Ireland, and it's massively problematic invasive species. So you don't know as well what could happen. So I'd rather sort of let nature take its course in many cases, unless there's a good reason that we've driven an extinction. And there's a whole I mean, forgive me if I'm rambling, but maybe we can talk another whole section of this is whether or not it's a sort of conservation triage, right? It's okay, so we've lost this species, or it's so rare, do we need to reintroduce it or bolster it? The question is, will that work? And that's another question maybe we can get into.
The subject is such that we can take it in a number of different directions. One thing that I want to pick out and kind of reiterate from what you said, and that's an argument that I come across, and I had a number of discussions, is about wolf reintroduction in Ireland. And on one hand, I think that at this point, everybody agrees that we shouldn't say oh, it's a solution to our deer problem. Just reintroduce wolves or lynx better, and they're gonna sort out deer overpopulation. That is not going to happen, and definitely it's not something we should be promising that this is gonna be a solution. Yet somehow, a general public, that's a quite common point of view. I don't think that any serious ecologists or even activists, in air quotes, would say that anymore, but it still seems to be quite popular among interested public, I would say. And an interesting counter-argument to that I heard is reintroducing wolves would be the act of decolonization, because that was, apparent, well, not apparently, but UK and the difficult history that was the main cause of wolves being extirpated from Ireland. So that is interesting that you kind of spoke to that. So that thing.
Well, I mean, I just to add, I mean, I wouldn't support, for instance, reintroduction of beaver to Ireland at the moment, because insofar as I can see, there's no historical evidence that beaver were ever there. However, if we can get past these barriers to wolf reintroduction, then I think that is something which we should aim to do. Although I just don't think it's something we have to rush through and end up causing more problems. You just need to get there with the different stakeholders, and people have got to compromise in how they're managed, for instance, and what's going to happen with stock losses or whatever it is. And we'll probably need to make a lot more habitat as well, which is, it's not just that these species were hunted, we also destroyed all the habitat. I mean, the problem with lynx is that they're a forest animal. They need lots of forest. And, you know, even in the United Kingdom, there's precious few areas which have got enough forest to host lynx. So that's the problem that we need to fix first, is to make sure we've got the habitat there. And for reintroductions to be successful, you need to make sure that the golden rule is to make sure the initial drivers of why things went extinct have been removed. And if we don't fix the social element behind things like wolves, then you're just going to get re-extinction, because you're going to get the same conflicts are going to emerge. And or if the habitat isn't right, and the habitat is not just in some cases, you know, the physical structure habitat, but also the climate niche. So what I alluded to earlier on is that some species that we're in the process of losing in the UK have been held up as targets for reintroduction, and we're just losing the climate niche of those species. I mean, you know, we talk about glossy ibises, we've got things like Zitting cisticolas, this, you know, Mediterranean little songbird, first bred in the UK this year. Something like Chetty's warbler was, you know, the nearest it occurred to the UK in the turn of the 20th century was the Mediterranean, literally the south coast of the Med, and now it's in Scotland. And we can't think that we're going to hold on to northern adapted species whilst all these Mediterranean species are arriving. I mean, it just strikes me as I don't understand why people are even advancing this when it's quite clear that species range is shifting, and then putting them back when that's the problem. It's just a waste of resources. So
it's almost like an animal welfare issue as well. Like, what are you doing? You're just, they're all moving away and dying. Like, why we do this?
Yeah, and it's a real struggle, you know, because we have to sort of, you end up having to let go of things. So what we need to know is whether or not the species we want to put back, if that's still part of its climate niche. Something like beaver, they've got huge climate niches, right? That's not a problem. For something like the little songbird, the little finch called the twite, it seems that we're losing them. You know, I mean, willow warbler, which is a species you probably know well, you know, beautiful cascading song. I mean, I guess I moved to Brazil in like 2010. I moved back in 2015, and in that time, willow warbler basically disappeared from the whole of Southeast England. We're right on the edge of the climate niche. You know, it was our commonest summer migrant, and in a very short space of time, that bird is disappearing, and it's disappearing for the sole reason that we're no longer with, you know, we're on the edge of its climate envelope, and you can't, no amount of reintroductions or putting that bird back will fix the problem. The only way you can fix that problem is to fix global climate change. And we're locked in for a lot of that. So that's, you know, it's just something you can't manage for anymore. So I think we've got to be a bit adaptive and think about these things, and it'd be Bonelli's warblers, you know, sort of in southern England, I guess, before you know it.
Yeah, and this is interesting because there's like so many things that are overlapping and changing, and like we changing, the climate is changing, and then are we going to reintroduce something? And so maybe that's a good moment to ask you about the issue of so-called wrong species, right? And I'm not saying that, so there's like a couple of things, and so I'm just going to throw a few points, and then you can speak to them in whichever order you feel like, right? So the one thing is the wrong species, saying like, hey, this is not that type of the animal, right? Like one of the examples were with bison that were, you know, reintroduced or introduced to the UK. Not really. We can talk about that as well. But it was like a wrong bison. There was a steppe bison, and the one that was there was right. So this is like, should we go with reintroducing of bison? That is the best bison you can get, because the one that should be there is not there, right? And from there is a point of like, hey, what if we just reintroduce a species that is filling the ecological role, is filling the ecological niche? Like it might be not the one that it used to be for whatever reason, but that one will do as well, filling that ecological niche, and then your trophic cascade is, you know, and biodiversity and all those arguments. And then, you know, the similar thing was, again, I put it again about the wolves in Yellowstone. It's like, oh, wrong species of wolves. They were too big, they were too small, they were too fierce, they were like all these conversations. So do you think that like when animal is gone, or do you think that there is some level at which it would be acceptable to use like wrong species in air quotes for like a greater good? Yeah, I'll stop here because there's a lot.
So yeah, there's again a lot to think about there. I got picking up on your when it's gone, and I thought you might say the de-extinction word, in which case I'd
no, I don't want to go there.
Here for 9 hours talking about that. But I mean, in the case of steppe bison, that's where we would be with that, right? And I certainly don't want to go there because it's not something I support for all sorts of reasons. But so to talk specifically to the bison example, then, so or the the European bison, seemingly the one paper I read recently talked about it being some historical even hybridization event between like aurochsen and steppe bison. So you had this sort of unique lineage or whatever. So we don't have any subfossil evidence of that species in the UK. So yeah, nominally it is an introduction rather than a reintroduction based on sort of IUCN guidelines, etc. Possible that someone may turn up a Wiscent fossil at some point. I guess there's a counter argument that says, well, humans' influence in the UK, especially for big species like that, goes further back into deep time, into the previous interglacial period, and maybe overhunting during the Pleistocene could have meant that recolonisation was impossible, etc. And I'm sort of willing to listen to some of those arguments. So it's not something I'm like absolutely dead against. I know some of the sort of people involved with that project as well. I guess for me, the challenge is it's not really reintroduction anyway at the moment, because it's some bison in a very large enclosure in Kent, and those individuals can't move anywhere. There's basically little or no chance that they may be allowed to spread anywhere. The British public have huge problems with wasps, let alone a very large bovid. So it seems unlikely it's going to go forward in a way, and it's going to be a solution. I mean, it's maybe nice as a demonstration impact of how megafauna can do different things. Although my argument, I guess, in a way, was that if it was never here, and especially if aurochsen and bison grazed and browsed in different ways, then being an island, we might have a slightly different community because of that. And I guess the question is then, do we have cattle that can behave in a similar way and be allowed to sort of behave as nature intended? And then you end up going down the whole net story and then wilder farming and everything else we've all heard a million things about. But I don't certainly not dispute the sort of the role of megafauna in shaping the landscape. I just can't necessarily see a huge role in Wiscent moving forward in shaping the British ecosystem simply for these not without precedents or NIMBYism reasons. I guess you look at when the Germans keep shooting whatever Wiscent crosses their border from Poland. So, and they've historically done much better than we have at coexisting with larger predators, etc. So yeah, I really don't see there being free-ranging bison anytime in the UK, anytime in the near future, I guess.
Yeah. But overall, like on the subject of like
proxies,
proxies.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's a great question. I guess it would have to be very well justified, and I think you have to think on a case by case basis. Because I can't think of, there aren't that many examples of species in Western Europe which are lost from everywhere, for instance. In terms of bird extinctions, what we're looking at like great auk, and they sort of talking about de-extinction. Otherwise, I don't think anyone would say, well, let's just grab a load of king penguins and release them and try and establish a population of those things. Because what's that? King penguins aren't great auks. They are different ecologically, right? So you're sort of de-extinction or bust. And again, you de-extinct a great auk, and it's not going to be the same thing. It's not going to be a great auk. It's going to be something which might have a bit of great auk DNA in it, and it's probably not likely to survive. I give a whole lecture, in fact, in one of my units on de-extinction, because insofar as I can see, there's very little. No one actually talks about what the actual cost is of actually making any of these reintroductions happen. There's a lot of talk about all the costs associated with trying to build back some proxy, but reintroductions are expensive. They can cost millions to successfully translocate pine martens to Wales. Imagine the cost associated with actual megafauna in the long term. So I don't think any of the things will ever happen for those reasons as well, because the people involved in doing these things aren't interested in actually following through on the reintroduction side. They're just interested in patents and moving that sort of stuff forward. So I think probably a red herring. There have, however, been examples elsewhere in the world where we've moved things around, like moving insular tortoises from one group to another, where, you know, giant tortoises have been lost, and some evidence that shown that has worked. And, you know, I think at that point, maybe that is worth doing. I even mentioned in a paper, one paper of my own, you know, years ago on the entire extinction of a little bird called a foliage gleaner. You have them in different parts of forests in South America and lots of different species. One which disappeared from the forests of northeast Brazil. I advocated maybe we should translocate individuals of its sister species from southern Brazil, who could fill that ecological niche of being this nuclear flock organizing species, which is clearly sorely missed by all the species there. So it's not something that I feel absolutely negative about. I just think we just need a very clear justification that doesn't lead us to, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had species X, Y, and Z? I think we definitely need to know that role is important. Definitely know it's been historically lost. Definitely know. I mean, in most cases, I think there's usually, except in these really extreme insular systems where they've had lots of species lost, there's usually a population of species X, Y, and Z around that we can put back. And there's some interesting examples of that recently, right? I can think of, you know, it seems at the moment with the red kites, we're now exporting our own red kites back to Spain, I heard recently. So the Spanish population is now doing quite badly, and we're now, you know, exporting British bred birds of Spanish origin back to Spain, which seems incredible, right? Another good example is, I forget the species of bee, but there was a species of bee which was introduced, you know, not a good thing, to New Zealand, but then the population disappeared in southern England, and they're now taking these bees back from New Zealand to reintroduce them back into England. So, you know,
DNA reservoir, right?
Yeah. But I wouldn't advocate that we should establish, you know, ex situ populations of everything for that case happen. The introduced species are still a much bigger problem and than almost anything else. I mean, again, we talk about introduced species a long time. I mean, I teach in a field course in East Africa, and you think of all the problems that people talk about East Africa, and people talk about trophy hunting and this and that and whatever. And the parks I go to, introduced species are the #1 problem by, you know, a country mile. You know, you're seeing huge areas covered by a sea of the same exotic species, and there's no, you know, there's no grazing for native mammals and everything else. And it's, you know,
but that we're now in a invasive species territory now, right?
Yeah. But it was only prompted by that thing. But I mean, it's just the risks associated with a translocation or a assisted colonization incur some invasion risk, basically.
Yes, for sure. So and this is like a little bit of a devil's advocate, but maybe not fully. Years ago, I read the book titled Restoring the Wild. Very well-known author. I forgot his name right now, but one of the big names in UK and British ecology. And the book was about a number of reintroductions that he was part of, and it was like everything from fish to red squirrels to birds and like everything. And when I was reading that book, I thought to myself, my God, the amount of red tape, the amount of permits, research, certificates, transport, like everything. And then subsequently I was listening to a podcast about moving, I think, rhinos or cheetahs within their range in Africa. And the same story. It was like a horror story when the animals in the crate, but they still need some permit, but they couldn't get it until they have an animal. So they have an animal, but they don't have a permit yet. And like it was just, and I'm thinking, like, first of all, kudos for anyone for even trying to overcome this mountain of red tape and bureaucracy and everything. And obviously the question is, like, is it really needed? These genetic purity tests and so on and so forth. And that maybe leads me to another slightly related aspect of it is, you know, like I said, we need to look carefully whether it's gonna work, you know, what are gonna be side effects, and at some point, like, you just can do only so much research. You need to try. You just need to put in an animal, at least I think, and that might be this devil's advocate the argument. You need to put the animal on the ground and see what happens, because often I feel like this is used as a way of deferring the introduction. It's like, oh yeah, but we need more research, and now we have a more. Oh yeah, but it doesn't cover like this thing, right? And we know that you can spend next 30 years doing research, and then someone will pick a hole in it and say, but you know. So I'm just, like, what is your view on like a limited trials, or just like a put an animal on the ground in enclosure and see what happens? And obviously there are concerns like, oh, what if bad things are happening? I'm now gonna go and kill all those animals, right? This is a question. And just as a last thing to that is about this animal, this bison reintroduction, right? And my thought, and again, that might be off the cuff comment, but my thought was like, if they're there and some societal collapse is happening and everything goes absolutely to shit, at least we have a chance of them being there, and within 100 or 200 years they will be like natives. So, but that's like half jokingly. But I just wanted your comments on, all the red tape and on the surface rightful caution and paperwork versus let's put the beaver, the lynx, the bison, the whatever on the ground and see actually what happens, because you can model and research this until you.
So, bit of multifaceted question then. I think restoring Wild is probably, is that one of Roy Dennis's?
Roy Dennis, that's the one. Yes, yeah. That's him.
So, I mean, I feel for practitioners that there are a lot of hoops to jump through. I can't speak to all of those hoops and to all of the challenges associated with that, though I know they're extensive. We sort of take students used to take students to go see one of the beaver enclosures that Cheshire Wildlife Trust have, and even just understanding the cost of that enclosure, which turned out to be staggering, and obviously they have to have all these checkups and everything else. So yeah, I appreciate that is a huge amount of effort. But for me, it comes back, there's various different lines of argument here and various different issues. I guess one issue is welfare for individuals. That's one issue, and that's covered by one set of guidelines. And as a conservation biologist, although I think welfare is important, it's not the thing which immediately sort of sets off alarm bells for me in many ways. Though welfare, you're going to disentangle the welfare of the individual from welfare of the population, welfare of other species. So, for instance, when we want checks on the health of beavers, we don't want to be importing pathogens or parasites which can impact the beavers and or impact other species as well. So having reasonable biosecurity protocols, which I know are expensive, are really important. Otherwise, we put ourselves at risk of having a huge problem. And once you've got a pathogen out there, that's potentially game over, right? You're not going to fix that problem. So it's always best avoided. In terms of individual behaviors and monitoring and this sort of stuff, well, I think in many cases, do we need the research? I think in many cases, we know what the habitat requirements of species are. And quite often it's people saying, well, these species won't persist in these landscapes. And there's good empirical evidence for this. And then it's often the people want to release them, want to challenge that. And they say, well, to get that, we have to have these animals out there. And this all comes back down to the fundamental point is that, at least historically, most reintroductions failed. They were unsuccessful. Success is getting better because it's evidence-led and science-based. If we go back to not doing the evidence of science, you just get more failure. You spend money, maybe you spend a bit less, you spend a bit less time, but you don't get a result. I think we sort of remiss of us not to think about where we are with this, is because reintroduction biology should be evidence-led. The reason we have monitoring and all these things is to make sure it succeeds, and understanding whether it's likely to succeed is really, really important. And that comes back to that initial question we talked about, right? It's likely to succeed if all the drivers of what drove things to extinction have gone. And if we think, well, we get these animals back in there, but the same human-wildlife conflicts are there, or the habitat isn't right, then again, it's going to fail. So I think, the data are important. Some of them, to me, are at different levels of importance. Animals will die in reintroduction programs. That will happen. It's not something I'm going to cry myself to sleep about if some animals die as a result of us well-meaningly trying to get those species back there. That's much less a priority for me than to make sure that that reintroduction is successful, because otherwise, you just more species individuals are going to die if you keep having to redoing something with bad data or whatever. But also to avoid any ecosystem level problems associated with either not being native or interactions weren't expecting, or just failure because, you know, it's a species which is going to have human wildlife conflicts, and if you've not done your homework, then the neighboring property shoots all your individuals and they're back to the same square one, spent loads of money, no result, etc. So, you know, I can't speak to all of the challenges, and imagine there's probably, I mean, I'm an academic, right? I have to deal with horrendous loads of admin all the time. I understand what it's like having admin, you know, crush my whole life. So I absolutely sympathize with it. And there's a lot of admin I can say that's terrible admin, we shouldn't be doing that. But there's a lot of admin I can think, well, actually, this is pretty important and we need these structures in place. So maybe there's a chance to revisit some of those things. I can't speak to them one by one because I haven't had to experience that. But normally I think these things are in place and are useful. Although that's not to say that we shouldn't be reviewing some of these things and being a bit more pragmatic, for instance. I think with the beavers, things have changed because, you know, we're moving forward with that now, and it is going forward, and we're slowly developing, you know, those schemes to try and, you know, reduce impacts and such like. So it's always at the start with species which are going to be more problematic. You're going to have these sorts of problems. But
the interesting fact is, like, the beavers are actually they're started as a completely illegal release. So I think, like, no one would condone in illegal releases, and there's like a whole plethora of problems with this. It's a wildlife crime essentially. But then on the same hand, like, hey, look at that. That was actually that worked out pretty well. We have to say that, right? So I don't know what's the question here. Like, if you have a time machine, would you prevent that illegal release of beavers and be here right now talking with me and no beavers?
It's a great counterfactual, and the answer is I don't know. What another question would be: has illegal release of beavers set back lynx reintroduction? That might be a different question, right? Have we undermined relationships with stakeholders for another species that we should put back because it was certainly here historically, but will result in some conflicts with people? Has there been a lot of trust, I guess? So the beaver regulation has released the hand of, you know, the powers that be have been forced. Of course, at the same time, we were doing all these trials. Some organizations spending huge amounts of money, while some other, you know, stakeholders are out there illegally releasing beavers. They got results. Not surprising, right? I mean, the problem with beavers, they went extinct historically because we killed them all. I mean, you just put beavers back in, they'll just do fine. And that's another thing we sort of talk about a bit. We sort of forget that, you know, you could put wolves back into the UK and Ireland, and they could spend their entire time killing invasive deer, which are eating invasive plants. And their entire ecosystem could involve no native species apart from long lost wolves, right? And then would we say, brilliant, nature is restored, right? We probably wouldn't, right? They will just fit back into the ecosystem because they're a generalist species, you know, intelligent, you know, wide-ranging, huge ecological niches. They will be fine. The problem with those species is us, right? Beaver is exactly the same thing. Adaptable, they will do fine. There was no issue about beavers surviving in our landscapes. All of the problems, well, mostly related to their interactions with us. And, you know, some valid counter arguments about, well, Britain's such a changed landscape. How might the beavers impact some of our species of conservation concern, hanging out in tiny nooks and crannies or whatever? I have time to hear those arguments as well. I think it's useful to understand what's going on so that we don't precipitate loss of species, which might be globally much rarer than beavers, for instance. That doesn't mean we don't go ahead with those reintroductions either. But I think that's the really important thing, is you have to sort of compartmentalize these different things. I mean, quite often the best reintroductions, well, the best reintroductions, I say, were the ones that the things just arrive, we don't have to do them. For things that we definitely hear before, if we know that the problem is gone, then they will do fine. The challenge is really when we got specialists, you know, is the habitat there for them? Is the climate niche still there for them? And these are the things we often need more data and a better understanding for, and a good justifications for. You know, there's no ecological argument not to put wolves, beavers, lynx back into our islands. The problems just relate to how we react with people there.
Hmm. What's your take on evidence of a species being at some point? Because like something I again spoke many times and thought many times about is, for example, wild boar in Ireland, or maybe even beaver or lynx. There are sort of like in Ireland they're in the same group that, on one hand, is like give me argument why they wouldn't be here. Maybe, right? There's very likelihood they've been here, and we have sort of like a cultural record. And you may comment on that, right? There's the names of places and all those things. And also we know that people were moving animals around. So there's a likelihood that lynx or wild boar were in Ireland. Now wild boar is a species of invasive species in Ireland, which is like, well, how come formerly native species is on the invasive list? It's another interesting question. But in terms of lynx, for example, and just by the way, just for the listeners, there is a good research that we don't have a habitat for lynx in Ireland, right? I think that even
at the moment,
yeah. I think I don't remember the name of the scientist. It's a young, talented scientist who wrote this paper. I don't remember his name, unfortunately, but he got like a really good analysis. And what I remember is like that even if the lynx were introduced in all the best places at high densities, within 100 years, they will be down to zero again. To your point, because of a habitat, and they just won't do that well. But like when I hear the argument like, oh, we don't have a fossil record of lynx ever being here, or wild boar, my counter argument is like, it's not like we're looking for him. It's just like it happened that we found something. There is no group. Like if we were to systematically look for fossil record, we might find it, but we're not doing it. So it's like, how good are those arguments, and what's your attitude towards cultural evidence or some, rather than having like, oh, I found this bone, like that could be moved there as well. So how much of that evidence?
That's also a good point. So yeah, lots to talk about there. The best evidence for a species' historic presence would be lots of bones ideally from lots of different places, lots of different ecological contexts, and from lots of different strata. And for many species, we have that. I mean, there's no contention, no question about wolves in the UK or wild boar, because there's huge numbers of bones. I mean, these were species that were widely hunted. They're in middens all over the place. They're in other formations. I mean, you say that we're not looking for these things, but I mean, there's entire people's professions is looking for these things. We've been looking at these things for a very long time. So I mean, the fossil record for big things is very, very, very good, which is why we can say with actually quite high certainty that some things weren't here. When it comes to, though, like amphibians or something, small things which don't fossilize very well, there is still actually quite a lot of information, but obviously it's less robust than for, big things, for instance. I was just thinking about this the other day, again, a post on social media. There's, I think, the one historical record of pygmy cormorant from the UK, from a midden in Oxfordshire. Now, pygmy cormorant, a bit like glossy ibis, was a bird which 50 years ago didn't really nest any closer than the Danube Delta, like the pelicans, but is now, bred in France the first time this year and is spread right across Europe. And it may well be back here. You could have said, based on that bone, you might have said, well, we could reintroduce them. I think it's a moot point now. I think they'll literally be here in the next 10 years. But I don't know. And what does that one bone say? I mean, there are bones of all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff from the Middle Ages. There are bones of macaws and stuff that was certainly never here, right? We were moving bits of animals around the planet for a very, very, very long time. This is well documented in the Americas as well, long before Columbian contact and genocide, that people were moving, macaws all the way up into North America from Central America. So we certainly move stuff around. And when it comes, for instance, to evidence for like pond turtles, a few shells would shock me that that's all there is. And I would suspect in that case that those few shells were moved because, tortoise shells, turtle shells are pretty amazing things, right? That people might move. So I think evidence there, you want it to be fairly robust. And if the evidence isn't there, well, you've got to have a pretty good reason why it's not there. If your thing doesn't fossilize or whatever, if you think it's so incredibly rare, but if it's not incredibly rare everywhere else, then why was that the case in the UK? I think the eagle owl is a good example of this, where there's, you know, very little evidence that the species was here in the Holocene. And yet, you know, if you look at something like golden and white-tailed eagles, there's just bones of those things everywhere. There's got vast numbers and vast amounts of evidence that those species were there. But, you know, eagle owls, there's virtually nothing there. So to hypothesize that we Neolithic people drove eagle owl to extinction in prehistory, to me, it doesn't make any sense. Like, why would they have done that? And then white-tailed eagles were still common in the Middle Ages, for instance, in golden eagles. So I think we need to get our arguments lined up. Place names, well, there's a whole massive academic literature on this, right? I think there's something in it. I think, you know, if you look at where there's papers on eagles, papers on wildcats, you look at all these things that are pretty suggestive that these were historical areas where these things occurred. But it comes with huge caveats, right? I mean, you can go look at dragon place names, and there's a lot of those. That doesn't mean that dragon is a reintroduction or a de-extinction candidate or whatever, right? It just means that place names are place names. I don't think, if that's all we're relying on, but I think that's quite weak evidence. I think it's nice in support, but I don't think we can use that as car-side evidence of things being here, and even in what context, right? I mean, birds can occur as vagrants. You know, you might have had a black stork or something that showed up somewhere, and that place became Stork Hill because someone shot a black stork there. It doesn't mean that there was black storks living there historically and bred there or whatever else. It just means there was a vagrant black stork.
That's a good point. It was anomaly rather than the norm.
Yeah, and that's why it might be a noteworthy thing to give it that name, right? I mean, single events here. I mean, I can think of what the place names in our, you know, valley is, like Lads Leap, where someone jumped and committed suicide. Doesn't mean that's something that happens there every time or whatever. Pick a morbid example, but it's just a place name. And I think we should be, you know, we shouldn't place too much emphasis on that. Though I think it's still useful to contextualize something. If it matches your other evidence, I think that's good. If it doesn't match your other evidence, especially if you're relying on that as evidence, I think that's quite weak. When it comes to boar, you've got the problem with, you know, what is a boar, right? And pigs were, you know, often born. They were basically out there and free roaming and feral at such like, and lots of place names here. Wild boar clough in the valley here. And were they wild boar then in the Middle Ages, or had they disappeared long before? And this is just people's, you know, feral pigs running around. And it's difficult to know, you know, where we are with these things. So I think I just sort of take it with a bit of a pinch of salt. But if it broadly matches your picture of where your fossil evidence is, then it probably means something.
Other argument was like, again, about place names, that people are just give a name based on something they knew from the place they came from, and they say, oh, you know, this looks like there should be wild boars here, let's put that name. It looks like it, but they may show up one day.
Yeah, well, that's the same for what we named other species when we colonized different parts of the world, and the English vernacular names, you know, reflect, you know, American robins and all these things, and locations, and you know, it's just exporting labels as well. So that's a good point.
What changed in terms of, is it like we have more people now? Because like you mentioned, like people were moving stuff around for millennia, and it seems there was no big deal about that. And then we have these things. Why now we should place on ourselves, you know, hold ourselves to higher standard, let's say, rather than, yeah, we were always doing that as a species. Let's move something around.
Well,
you know?
I think it's recognizing a wrong, right? It's one of our biggest drivers of biodiversity loss is when we either meant to or accidentally took species from different parts of the world. You know, it drove most of the homogenization of biota on islands, and it's increasingly a problem on continents as well. And I find it incredible how, you know, what you can still buy in garden centers. I was just watching a gardening the other day when someone was like, well, yeah, this is my garden moment. This is all free. This is all self-seeded here and everything else. And I'm like, oh my God, you know, it's spreading to next door. And it's just, we do this constantly. And, you know, I go for a walk, you know, out the door here, and the whole place is Himalayan balsam and rhododendron. And you think, oh, this is such a disaster. And yet, you know, it's been so far behind in you know, it's just the next species, and not to mention plant diseases and everything else, and our favorite trees all disappearing. And so I think, yeah, the horticultural industry and garden centers, you have got, you know, this a huge burden of responsibility.
This is a good point, because like we talk about reintroductions, people think like wolves, right? That's very like lynx, But there's this whole things like insects and plants and stuff that is attached, seeds to your jacket, and you come back from so that goes into entire like a biosecurity thing. And then there's no red tape there. There's no nothing. You know, like one of the things is in diseases, I suppose, is also with this with African swine fever.
Tree diseases are the big thing. I mean, you think about Dutch dieback, Dutch elm disease. People talking about novel diseases with oaks and hawthorn and all these things. I mean, we're running out. We have a depauperate tree flora as it is, right? Because of a biogeographical happenstance, right? If you imagine the trees trying to move north and south, blocked by the Himalayas and the Alps and everything else, we got all these extinction filters, which is quite different in the US, where you've got all the mountain ranges run north-south, so movements was much easier. And then, we're importing all these diseases and we're risking running out of trees entirely. I get you can almost segue there to people talking about, well, what we're going to do about that, and we're going to then move lots of exotic tree species in. And at that point, I'm not even sure where my argument lies, because if it's true, we're going to lose everything, and probably need to be thinking about that. But it's another podcast for another day, that one. But my big point, I think, is we need to really get a better handle on introductions of stuff, just the things that we buy. I mean, the huge problems in aquatic systems with what were things were legal to buy like 5-10 years ago are now banned, and they're now costing millions and millions of pounds worth of damage to waterways and etc. So there's a big problem out there as well, which arguably is much bigger than reintroductions, but you sort of never know, especially if something isn't justified. And again, for me, rhododendrons are sort of a useful sort of counterfactual.
You're making excellent arguments for red tape on on reintroductions. Alex, for the listeners who are listening to that, they supporting rewilding, they supporting ecological restoration, nature restoration, habitat restoration, the whole deal. What is the key takeaway you would like them to take from our conversation, or maybe key principle that you would like them to think once their mind wander into like how awesome it would be to introduce, and then like you mentioned, menu list of all these things?
I think for me the key take is at the moment I just seems like it's so often framed as if reintroduction is the way we fix the biodiversity crisis. I think when justified reintroduction is something good that we should be exploring. But I just think in terms of fixing the biodiversity crisis, it's, relatively unimportant. And the big things we need to do are fix are habitat loss and habitat degradation, habitat fragmentation, introduce species, connectivity, reducing impacts from climate change. These are all the big things. And there's a risk of it becoming a distraction and feeling we can just reintroduce a way out of this crisis by moving a few species historically lost, most of which are quite common globally, will do really well anyway, and probably won't fix our crisis. So I think we need to recognize that when these species are definitely lost, we should put them back, but we can't put the emphasis this is somehow going to fix the crisis, and actually this is the most important thing we need to prioritize, because there's no evidence that it is. And that comes from the fact that, this crisis we've really seen ramping up in the last few decades, from this baseline in monitoring in the 1960s, and most of the things we're talking about reintroducing were gone long, long before. And the things we cherish, the things we've lost, we've lost those relatively recently for all these other reasons. And if the government's prioritizing that, then it might not be thinking, it might think that's enough to keep voters happy. We're not going to tackle the real challenges and the real problems, which are going to impact, far, far more species. And in fact, maybe wide range species that we've been talking about, well, they'll be all right anyway, because, if you're a species with a pan-European distribution, you can probably get away with more of these anthropogenic drivers, so long as you're not being directly killed by people. In the meantime, we'll be losing everything else. So I just think we need to recognize that it's not the most important thing on the list of priorities of conservation biologists. Engage with it when it's justified, get it done if you like, but not give the public false hope that this is going to fix the biodiversity crisis.
Yeah, Alex, final question, and I'm really interested in your answer to that. Like, how do you see the future of biodiversity, climate, nature playing out 50, 100 years? Like you pick the time frame, but how do you're optimist, you're pessimist, you're like, where are you on this spectrum?
It's difficult to say. It depends what you want to measure and where. I mean, where we are in Northwest Europe, then there's a lot of uncertainty there, right? I mean, if we end up getting a shutting down of the thermohaline circulation, well, we might be back in with willow warblers and twite and all these northern adapted species because we might be incredibly cold and we'll lose all these recent southern colonists. If not, and we just continue to get warmer and warmer, well, we'll see, sort of more Mediterraneization, if you like, of our biota, and we'll lose some species. We might even have more species than we did historically. But at a global level, well, you're going to see massive losses, especially in the tropics, because we're going to hit the upper end of the thermal niche for, many birds. You're going to hit wet bulb temperatures for all sorts of species. At high latitudes, you're going to get all sorts of extinctions of species whose climate niche disappears, to the North Pole. So it's difficult globally not to see lots of extinctions sort of baked in. But, climate action and fixing all these problems can mitigate that, right? I think it's no point in being a doomsayer to the extent that we can't fix some of these problems, but equally need to be realistic to recognize that there's going to be a lot of loss baked in. What we need to do is change the course of where we're going here, and we need to facilitate, natural colonization and make sure we've got connectivity planned out for species at continental levels, whilst also recognizing that we don't want to, be the sole engine that's driving this. We want to facilitate biodiversity to move and or recover on its own without being the sole arbiters of that process, if you like.
Alex, thank you so much. I'm sure that listeners learn a lot, and hopefully they will look at the rewilding and reintroductions in slightly more nuanced approach rather than, it's going to fix everything. It's surely a good thing. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you, Tommy.
And before you go, since you stick to the end of this show, then first and foremost, thank you so much for listening and for watching. And if you enjoy what I do here, and I presume you do since you listen to the very end, you should subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the description of the show, newsletter.tommysoutdoors.com. So get in there and you will get notifications not only about the latest episodes of the podcast, but also about everything else that is happening in the conservation and science world.